There's a number that keeps showing up in real estate listings across this country, and it sounds almost like a typo. $28,000, $19,000, sometimes less than the price of a used car. 3 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, an acre of land, sometimes more. For a moment, it feels like the system has glitched. Like somewhere out there, Canada forgot to update its prices. But it isn't a glitch. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what that number is really telling you. Because a price that low is never just a price. It's a message. A quiet, bureaucratic message about what happens to a place once everyone stops needing it. Let's start at the bottom of the list. The towns where the irony is almost funny. Almost. On the Atlantic coast, there's a town built entirely around one fish. For nearly 500 years, cod was the reason this place existed. Boats went out at dawn. Fish plants ran around the clock. Entire generations grew up knowing exactly what their lives would look like because the ocean had always provided. Then, in 1992, it stopped. The northern cod stocks collapsed so completely that the federal government imposed a moratorium. Overnight, thousands of people lost the only work they'd ever known. The town didn't disappear right away. That's not how it works. It happened slowly. A shop closed, then another. Young people left for Alberta, for Ontario, for anywhere with a job posting. The houses stayed behind, built solid, built to last generations. But the generations stopped coming. Today you can buy one of those houses for less than the cost of a decent used truck, ocean view included. Walk down the main street and you'll notice something strange. The houses aren't falling apart. They're just waiting. Paint peeling slightly, lawns slightly overgrown. As if the town is holding its breath, expecting people who already left 30 years ago to come back. They won't. Out on the prairies, there's a town that exists because of a single decision made over a century ago. And it nearly stopped existing because of a single decision made decades later. When the railway came through, this town was born almost instantly. A station, a grain elevator, a main street that filled in within a few short years. For a while, everything that moved through this part of the country moved through here. Then, sometime in the latter half of the 20th century, the railway company made a calculation. The line wasn't profitable enough. The branch was cut. And just like that, the town's entire reason for existing, the thing that had built it, the thing that had given it a purpose, was gone. What's left now is almost eerie in its symmetry. The grain elevator still stands, hollow and gray against the sky, a monument to a function nobody remembers needing. The main street is mostly intact. The houses are mostly sound. But walk through at dusk, and you'll count more empty windows than lit ones. A town built around a line on a map, erased the moment that line was redrawn. In Ontario, there's a former mining community where the buildings tell one story and the population tells another. The houses here are good houses, solid construction, the kind built by a company that expected its workers to stay for decades. For a while, they did. The mine ran, the town thrived. There were churches, a hockey rink, a school with more students than it could comfortably hold. Then the ore ran thin, or the price dropped, or both. It's usually both. The mine didn't shut down dramatically. It scaled back, then scaled back again. Each round of layoffs took a few more families with it, until what remained was a town sized for thousands, holding a few hundred. And here's the part that makes this one different from a simple ghost town. Nothing is broken. The infrastructure works. The houses are livable. You could move in tomorrow. What's missing isn't shelter, it's purpose. There's no job waiting for you here, and there hasn't been for a generation. The town is, in every practical sense, still standing, just standing for no one. In northern Quebec, there's a settlement that has existed for generations, and that, to this day, has never been connected to the rest of the province by a paved road. For decades, residents relied on winter roads, temporary routes carved across frozen ground and ice, usable only a few months a year. The rest of the time, the community was reachable by plane, or not at all. Promises were made over the years about permanent road access. Studies were commissioned. budgets were discussed, and then, somehow, the project always slipped to next year, and the year after that. The result is a place where a house can be sold for almost nothing, because owning it means owning a building that, for half the year, exists at the end of a road that doesn't exist. It's not isolation by accident. It's isolation by omission, by decades of infrastructure decisions that simply never prioritized this place enough to finish the job. And once you understand that, the price tag stops looking like a bargain. It starts looking like a verdict. We're moving now into territory where the abandonment stops feeling like bad luck and starts feeling like a pattern. In Manitoba, there's a community that floods, not occasionally, repeatedly, predictably, almost on schedule. It wasn't always this way. The town was built on a floodplain back when floodplain was just a word on a map, not a warning. For decades, it worked fine. Then the floods started coming more often and worse. Homes were rebuilt after one flood, then flooded again, rebuilt again, flooded again. At a certain point, residents began asking for something simple, a permanent flood control solution, a dike, a diversion, something that would let them stop rebuilding the same houses every few years. The response, again and again, has been a patchwork of temporary measures, sandbags, emergency funding, short-term fixes that treat the next flood as a surprise, even though everyone involved knows it's coming. So now you can buy a house here for next to nothing, and you'll own it right up until the next flood arrives, at which point you'll understand exactly why the previous owner was so willing to let it go. In rural Saskatchewan, there's a village that lost something smaller than an industry, smaller than a railway. And somehow, it was enough to end the town. It lost its school. For a small community, a school isn't just a building. It's the reason young families stay. It's where parents meet other parents, where the next generation puts down roots before they even realize it. When enrollment dropped low enough, the decision was made to close it. Students would be bused to a larger town nearby. On paper, it looked efficient, consolidation, cost savings. But something quieter happened underneath the spreadsheet logic. Families with young children stopped moving in. Families already here started leaving, because raising kids in a town with no school, just a long bus ride every morning, isn't really raising kids in that town anymore. The school building still stands, empty, windows dark, and around it, a village that didn't lose a building so much as it lost its future, one bus route at a time. Now we arrive at something different. Something that wasn't caused by an industry collapsing, or a railway closing, or a river flooding. This one was a decision. In Newfoundland, between the 1950s and 1970s, the provincial government ran a series of resettlement programs, official policy, designed to relocate residents of small, uneconomic outport communities into larger centers. The logic on paper was about efficiency. It would cost less to provide services to fewer, larger towns than to hundreds of scattered coastal communities. So families were offered money, modest amounts, to leave. Houses were sometimes floated across the water on barges to new locations. Others were simply abandoned where they stood. Entire communities, some inhabited for centuries, ceased to exist within a few short years. Not because anyone died, not because of war or disaster, because a government decided the math didn't work anymore. What's left in some of these places are the bones of a town. Foundations, root cellars, the outlines of gardens slowly disappearing into the grass. And in places where a few houses remain standing, you can buy one of them today for the price of a vacation in a community that, officially, was supposed to stop existing 50 years ago. In British Columbia, there's a former mining community where the danger isn't that the town emptied out. It's what's underneath it. For decades, this was a working town, a real one, with families, schools, a downtown that mattered. The mine produced. The town grew around it. But mining leaves things behind. Tailings, runoff. Decades of industrial waste that, for a long time, simply went into the ground and the water nearby, because that's how it was done, and because cleaning it up wasn't anyone's priority until it became impossible to ignore. By the time anyone seriously addressed it, the contamination had settled into the soil, the groundwater, the sediment of nearby waterways. Remediation became a massive, expensive, multi-decade undertaking, the kind of project that gets studied more than it gets solved. So now there are houses here, structurally sound, sitting on land where the question isn't, is this a good investment? It's, what's actually in this ground, and who's responsible for it? The price reflects that question. Most buyers, once they understand it, walk away. We're entering the final stretch now, the places where the silence isn't an accident. It's the result. In rural Alberta, there's a community built around a single piece of infrastructure, a power plant that for decades was the largest employer for miles in any direction. When that plant closed, part of a broader shift away from the energy source it relied on, the town lost more than jobs. It lost its entire economic identity in one announcement. What makes this one different is what didn't happen afterward. In some places, plant closures come with transition funding, retraining programs, economic diversification grants, some kind of acknowledgement that an entire community's livelihood just vanished and needs help finding a new one. Here that didn't really materialize, or it materialized in small, scattered pieces, a grant here, a study there, nothing close to the scale of what had been lost. So the town did what towns do when there's no plan. It shrank, quietly, house by house. The people who could leave, left. The people who stayed did so because leaving wasn't an option, not because staying made sense. And the houses they left behind now sit for sale at prices that make sense only once you understand. You're not buying a home in a town, you're buying a home in what used to be one. In northern Ontario, there's a town that shouldn't really exist as an independent place at all, because it never was one. It was built by a single company. Every house, every street, the school, the arena, the store, all of it constructed and owned by one corporation, for the sole purpose of housing workers for one operation. For years this worked. The company provided. The town depended on it completely, by design. And then, the company left. Not gradually. Not with years of warning and managed decline. The operation was deemed no longer worth running, and within a relatively short window, it wound down. Workers were let go. Services the company had quietly been funding, things residents may not have even realized were corporate, not municipal, simply stopped. No transition fund, no long-term severance for the town itself. The corporation had built a community as a tool, used the tool, and set it down when it was no longer useful. What remains is a town with no employer, no original reason to exist, and a population trying to figure out how to be a real, independent community, decades after the fact, with none of the infrastructure that real communities are usually built with over time. The houses are cheap because, in a very real sense, the town was never meant to outlive its purpose. And it has, just barely. And now, the final one. The one that ties everything together. Somewhere in this country, there's a community where you can buy a house for less than almost anything else on this list. Less than a used car. Less than a year of rent in a major city. And the reason isn't a collapsed industry. It isn't a flood, or a closed mine, or a company that left. It's something quieter than all of that. This community's existence was never fully formalized. Not in the way towns are usually formalized, recognized boundaries, official population counts, a clear place in provincial records that acknowledges, in writing, that people live here and have for a long time. It exists. People have lived here for generations. There are houses. There's a history. But on paper, in the registries and records that determine where infrastructure money goes, where services get prioritized, where a place shows up when someone in a government office is deciding what gets funded next year, this place barely registers. And that absence isn't neutral. It has consequences. Roads that don't get maintained. Services that don't get extended. A community that exists in every way that matters to the people living there, and almost not at all in the place where decisions get made. So the house is cheap, almost free. Because officially, in the place that decides what things are worth, there's barely anything here to value at all. And maybe that's the real ending to this list. Not a flood. Not a mine, not a company walking away, Just a line that was never drawn, a place that was never quite written down, and a price tag that, in its own quiet way, is just telling the truth. Because a $19,000 house was never really about the house. It was about everything that had to disappear or never fully appear for that number to make sense.